Welcome back to the Corner of Story and Game. Today I'm excited to be joined by Andrea Peréz, a multilingual narrative designer with extensive experience in the video game industry. Andrea has played a pivotal role in shaping narratives for various titles and deeply understands emergent narratives in digital games. Today we're going to dive into how this concept transforms player experiences and storytelling in games in general. So, Andrea, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
I'm excited to sit down and talk with you today about emergent narratives, one of my favorite topics, right up there with survival crafting RPGs and, and BioWare. But today, let's talk emergent narratives. But before we get into it, I'd like to set the stage with your origin story. Who is Andrea? How did you fall in love with writing and gaming? What was your journey to get here today?
Who was a hero's journey? So my name is Andrea. Thank you for having me again. So the way that I got into games really was just, I think that my first game was when my dad and my uncle accidentally left a GTA title just out in the open, and 4-year-old me decided to just go wild at GTA at age 4. I turned out fine though. And then years later, I kind of really got into just working on levels in Little Big Planet. Then League of Legends was a huge part of just growing up. And I would just spend hours reading these descriptions of characters. And I think I memorized 189 character biographies, give or take. From who they were. I read all of the additional content, really getting into that lore. And I always love just exploring franchises where it's not just you play the game and that's it. It's I was that kid that went to the wikias, the forums, and really explored it. And so I get into a creative writing program in college, and there was this client, because the way that the school is set up is they have kind of what's it called? It was called a collaboratory at the time, and it basically a client would pay students to work for them, so you would have experience early on, because the whole mantra of that school was to break the myth of the starving artist by providing you experience early on. So I joined one of those sessions in the collaboratory, and the client wanted students to just kind of pitch games for them that they could then kind of take into a full project. At the time, I was called the writing person for the game. And so I came up with characters, lore, dialogue, the pitch deck, and everything without knowing the nomenclature for it. Then there was a game writing course that opened up in that semester. And I'm like, oh, this is a path. So I just went for it really and started just kind of digging into game engines, game jams, communities, networking like a maniac. I would spend hours and hours networking while working on my thesis. And I had already been talking to a lot of folks at Fire Access, just kind of they would be participating in events in collaboration with Latinx in gaming. And I would just show up, talk to their art director, HR. And so they seemed a lovely pair of folks to work with. And by pure coincidence, one of my mentors also became a narrative lead for Fire Access. And in April of 2022, I think I got reached out of hey, we may be looking for writers. Was that something you'd be interested in? I'm like, yes. Who wouldn't want to be a writer? And I had heard wonderful things too of just writing for Fire Access as well, which a lot of people don't think of when they think of just kind of that, right? But because you think game writing, you might think your Deck 9, Telltale, and Fire Access was kind of out of people's vision, I guess. But when they opened up the applications, I applied, went through the, 2 rounds, and I became a writer for Civ 7. That was my first job in the industry, which was kind of crazy looking back on it. And I had so much fun. Just kind of being able to work for a franchise that big. And I'm glad that we are having this podcast now and not a year ago, because now, games been announced, and it's just been a lovely journey. And since then, I've worked for a couple of indie projects. Some started some of my own. And that was just a long-winded way of saying I just kind of have always had a passion for games and writing, and try to merge those passions into this quirky little discipline we have.
Were you a voracious reader growing up as well? Did you rip through the novels and the...
Oh God. When I was, I think I finished all of Twilight in a matter of months when I was too young Or yeah, like Twilight, and when it was all the rage before the social media stuff, like Harry Potter, where it was just kind of like, I think, like, mind you, I think at one point when I was 9, I read a dictionary out of boredom, because I want a spelling bee, and then it's like, oh yeah, here you just want a bilingual spelling bee, and then here's a dictionary, and I'm like, I might as well just like go through it, and I guess that helps a little bit, like you're writing parks and you're trying to like come up with like new ways, and it's like when you have like a thesaurus in your mind, it kind of like helps. But no, yeah, I was a voracious reader and I always just kind of like love learning new things, just kind of like of different disciplines as well, because narrative, I think, is like a very collaborative like craft because you need to be able to come up with a story that works under a gazillion constraints. You need to understand what's the limitations of art. You need to understand the technical limitations. How many characters does it fit in like the UI UX of the game? So because I was so interested in like learning about every different like facet of game development, that really helped kind of like in flourishing as a narrative designer, being able to like from the get-go come up with a story that is conceivable rather than like having this back and forth of like, I have this story idea. Wait, Andrea, we can actually do that. And then like, like that iterative process was able to be like streamlined when you like have a solid, like not an expertise, but just an understanding of like different, things about game development.
Yeah, 100%. Did you play tabletop role-playing games, board games? Were you a physical gamer as well growing up?
Well, so growing up, not so much of physical games, chess and solitaire maybe, but I played Dungeons and Dragons starting like in when I was 17. And it was actually my now husband who introduced me to it. I went to like a summer camp. That's where like I met him. And then I just really liked the medium. And one of my early portfolio pieces was Dungeons and Dragons 5e supplement that immersed the player in the world of Dante's Inferno. Yeah, like the Comedy. And that really interested a lot of people. And it's like a very hefty document because like I did art for it and I did like all of these things for the supplement that I'm even like to this day just trying to like keep adding things to it. But yeah, no, I fell in love with like tabletop games like as soon as I learned about them. Like there's Lancer as well, which is kind of like mechas and it's series in played Fabula Ultima, Pathfinder, 2e. We've played D&D 5e, Star Wars 5e. And I think I'm prepared for like a game that's in like the Marvel universe with a couple of friends. So very much like both of us are now like just in the trenches of tabletop.
Right on. Yeah. It all goes hand in hand. Like writing, reading, playing, gaming, all of these, they all go together so tightly.
Yeah, it all ties into just you're telling stories, how you tell the story, like differs from the medium. And that's kind of like why I'm very much like in my personal kind of like work, I love exploring different facets of it because I feel like in the industry, there's this fear of like generalists, right? Where it's like kind of like when you have like what is it that you really do? Right. I think that when you're able to just kind of like have like a common thread to like who you are as a developer, which for me is just kind of like enhancing stories of Latinidad, regardless of the medium. When you have that common thread, it really just kind of like helps bring all of these like things that make me as a developer like this weird mix of like technical production and narrative knowledge. And to just, yeah, I just want to tell stories about more people like me.
That's brilliant. I love it. Love it. Okay, well, let's move into the topic of the day, emergent narrative. So I'm going to let you establish the picture for us, set a frame. In your opinion, what is emergent narrative and how is it different than other traditional narrative structures in games?
I'm glad that you say opinion because that's very key narrative design. We have this so ever wonderful thing about our craft that it's not really standardized. And we love that. So that's a lot of sarcasm, by the way, if somebody cannot see my expressions. But so I think that emergent narrative is just kind of like stories that emerge from either the player or the system. And so what that means is that as a developer, you can create kind of like a bank of stories and then plug them into the game. That's an oversimplification, of course. And then how the player interacts, if they hit certain criteria, then your stories kind of like emerge, right? That's how I would describe it, where like the player just navigates the world. But as a storyteller, you have embedded the stories into it. And set like certain criteria that has to be met, kind of like when you're just coding with logic, right? Where like if player does XYZ, then this story happens. And so what gets tricky with like narrative, like that narrative that's emergent versus narrative that's linear is like linear narrative feels more like script writing under like the understanding that it's interactive and that it would branch, obviously. Whereas like when it's emergent, it's just kind of like you have all of these stories that just kind of like, sprout almost like a garden in front of the player. How do you tie them all together? Right. But that is like, again, I am not the monolith or like the spokesperson of emergent narrative by any means, but that's how I interpret the definition. And there's other kind of like institutions and universities that have like academic like responses to that question. But to me, that's kind of like how it is, where like either the player's decisions or just kind of like the criteria that's embedded in the systems are what cause these stories to just emerge naturally through the game.
And all I'm looking for is your opinion. I could go and look up the technical terms and the current consensus on what that term means, but no, I want to know what your thoughts are on the topic. So I've heard others say that emergent narrative is the story that we discover along the way. It's instead of telling a story as a game dev, you're putting pieces of a story in a world and hoping that the player finds them and connects them, maybe, possibly. With that in mind, what would you say are some of the key elements we need to consider when trying to embed those disjointed pieces of story in our world?
I think having a clear idea of what the player experience is going to be so that you know how to place the pieces to begin with, right? Like they load the screen, what are they seeing, right? Like how are they going to navigate the level and how are they going to find those pieces that you're talking about that unlock the story? Is it hidden in an item? Is it hidden like in the environment? Is it like through an NPC interaction? So as a designer, you need to just kind of like have an understanding of kind of like what the player is going to experience and then just from that work. And so my process, at least just kind of like in my projects, whenever I'm doing like an emergent narrative, it's just kind of like play testing a lot of like the current build or whatever that I'm working on. And then just kind of like realizing like, okay, am I actually unlocking what I wanted to unlock? Right. And if not, then can I add kind of like a common thread again? Like, is there like do we want these stories to kind of like only be unlocked in this level so that like it makes sense, like you can only unlock story A when you're kind of like in level A and not like in the second one, because then like if you're like in this level unlocking a story that was meant for like this other one, right? Like you want to have like parameters just kind of like really understood and the experience like just a really good pulse check on it, if that makes sense.
It does, and that's an important consideration. What is your thoughts on, and we're going off script here, what are your thoughts on systems like Shadows of Mordor had a fantastic system. I can't remember the name of it right now, and I feel horrible for that. But there's a way for interactions with NPCs and enemies would tag things and trigger things, and then the story would develop based on. So an orc you defeated would show up later, more powerful, and the leader of a band, and there would be a story that would emerge out of that because of the system.
Yeah. Those are some of my favorites, especially like when it's reoccurring, because then it feels like a quest. Like you want to just kind of like give the player that like feeling of mastery and then also of like sequence, that there's kind of like this progression of the story. Because again, like what's challenging about emergent narrative is that you don't want it to feel random. You want it to feel that it's kind of like sprouting, but in a certain order that is intentional and not like, whoops. Of course, like you can't ever predict every single permutation of a player. I want to just disclose that to everyone that's listening, viewing, what have you. It is because like when you start kind of like, I feel like this is something that like, especially like juniors kind of like fall into, where it's like, oh my God, but do I have a story for like this very, very specific player type? And what of like the player that just wants to like skip cutscenes? Do I have stories for everyone? You can't. Please, everyone, learn that early on, because that would have saved me time. But yeah, no, I really like those systems. Just because like it really again brings forward the immersiveness, and like as a player, like I've really affected this world in a certain way. Like the decisions that I made have weight, have value, have consequences. And I think that that's definitely something that I want to see more of just in games in general.
Mhm. Oh, yeah, agreed. In my opinion, there's another type of emergent game, and you touched on it. You touched on the one where the system I go back to Minecraft, where playing the game allows me and my son to have a story that we're going to tell around the supper table later on. It has nothing to do with what's in the game. There's no story written into it. There is now in Minecraft, but back then there was no story. It was just us telling the story of we went into a cave, we ran into a creeper, it exploded, blah blah blah. Is there a way as a game dev to create those experiences? What are considerations when you want to try and create that kind of emergent play?
Right. That's a good question because it's very much like open world, right? And so I think just kind of like understanding like what the message of the game is going to be and what you want players to take from it. Like, do you want players to go from Minecraft with like a sense of exploration, of wonder, curiosity? And so try to lean into like stories that revolve around those themes and subjects so that then like you can kind of like implant them in the world and also like enable as much freedom as possible, which Minecraft does a great job at, obviously.
Right.
But yeah, I think also like to a certain extent, like Legend of Zelda does a good job about it, but where it's kind of like you don't have to follow a certain order. Like the world is there, but as a player, like you can not explore like in whatever order you want, and then like a narrative will emerge from it, right?
Oh yeah, I was just curious. Let's go back to the more structured ones where you're actually trying to work in story pieces to create a narrative that is emergent. How do you balance, and this is always comes up all the time, it's kind of cliche at this point, but I'm still curious, how do you, in your opinion, how do you balance player agency with making sure the pieces are in the right place for that emergent narrative?
I don't want to sound like a lawyer, but it depends so much because, right? Because, like, well, like, it depends also, like, on the project, on the scope, because there will be games where, like, you want, it's kind of like coming up with a tutorial, right? Like, do you want this tutorial to kind of like be just kind of like you throw the player into the deep end and then they figure out the controls on their own? Or do you want to, like, hold their hand and, like, show them the controls one on one? So, first, establish what route do you want to go with? Like, do you want to hold, like, the player's hand through this story? Or do you want to just kind of like let them do as they wish, right? And if so, it's kind of like, okay, the player has this agency. What choices do they want? And also, like, what restrictions are these decisions, right? Because if there's like a dialogue prompt and then it's kind of like choice one, talk to like this NPC, choice B, follow this quest, choice three, change the cosmic entity's gender. Like, I don't know, like, right? Like, you need to balance like choices,
Yeah.
and make them just kind of like have cohesion. That would be the main one, just kind of like ensuring that the stories just kind of like make sense and offer the player like a lot of freedom. It's a very difficult balance that again just kind of like ties into just kind of like what game is it? What team are we talking about? Like, are we talking about like 70 people have to like, come to a unison of like a decision? Or is it just one person?
Well,
Right? So I don't know if that answered the question well.
yeah, yeah, it does. It sets a frame for us at least, but it does bring to mind something that kind of I'm curious. Can you think of a game that you've worked on, or perhaps a game you've played that you love or admired, where emergent storytelling, emergent narrative really worked, and like why did it really work in that case?
I would say, in my opinion, that in Hades it really works because it's kind of like the narrative is so embedded in the system. Where like one of my favorite moments in Hades, and it's like a very rare one, right? Where it's like before you approach a certain NPC, you can get rid of your entire inventory, which in a roguelike is like insane, right? But then there's going to be like an interaction that sprouts from that, right? So yeah, where it's one of those like whenever a game has kind of like those secret like stories that like take you by surprise and also want you to like make you as a player want to go back and see like what others are hidden. That's my favorite type of use of like just emergent narrative as a system where it's just kind of like when as a player I'm given kind of like an insight into like the permutations that the team has accounted for and just kind of like all the different possibilities. Because who could have possibly come out that like when you get rid of like a very specific thing in your inventory, like you have this one interaction, or like when you go this certain path. Again, it's something where like it's very much like it's very technical, of course, but it makes me just kind of like appreciate the work that the developers put into it even more. Because even coming up with that, I think was just like a stroke of genius.
I feel like emergent narratives have the potential to knock your primary storyline off kilter, how important is it, in your opinion, to bottleneck, to bring things back together, to somehow pull these narratives back? Or is it fine to have side narratives that are just emergent and don't matter? Like, where do you fall on that one?
My producer brain's just kind of like going like keep the scope a little bit smaller. I do when the spirit of the game is all about exploration, I think then having like a variety of side quests, again, like you want to give kind of like different experiences to different players because you're never going to have like, just one type. That's kind of like where I think marketing works very well with narrative design, where like in marketing and user research, you kind of like have to create these profiles of like who your target demographic is going to be, who your consumer is going to be. Because something that I talk about a little bit every now and then is I have 7 years of marketing on top of like my experience in games. So I'm always kind of like thinking about like, what is like the core audience for the game that I'm making? And if so, like, how can I just kind of like, and keep it to like a pool of maybe like five, core groups rather than like, thinking about 30,000 or something. And instead it's just kind of like, what is it? Yeah, just trying to come up with a story for each of those and like in a place and allow them to kind of like explore a play style that caters to their needs while still just kind of like I do still think that even though like you want them to explore, drawing them back to kind of like at least like a beat is really instrumental in just kind of like allowing players to have an idea of like when the story began and when did it end. And am I in the middle or like where am I? You want to always kind of like give them an idea of where they are in the game, I think. So I think it's very important to draw them back in. But I also really think that designers should lean more towards like the exploration and freedom to, again, encourage that agency that a lot of players are craving.
And a game that has an ending, a clear ending, how important is it to bring things to a satisfying closure?
It's very important, but it's also a bit of a challenge because it's like, let's say that you're like in a game of like 30 hours of gameplay, like you're going to have to account for like, okay, like more or less like what decisions could the players have gone through by the time that you hit like the 30-hour mark, right? So it's like it's very important to like just kind of like have this understanding as a team of like, what you want the ending to be and what you want the player to have experienced either like as like minimum of like you started the game and you just like had like a speed run, or if a player wants to just kind of like go through millions of side quests, like what is like an ending that would just kind of like make that experience worth it and just kind of like tie it in a neat bow like a gift to them.
But when it works, it works, right?
Hmm.
You mentioned marketing, and I'm curious, when you're working on an emergent narrative project, a project that has an emergent narrative in it, how important is collaboration with, like you mentioned marketing, but what about playtesting or any of the other departments? How important is that?
In every project that I'm in, I always try to have, I mean, obviously, you should collaborate with everyone, period. But the departments that I usually try to specifically really have just kind of like a constant loop of communication with is programming and QA. Because you really want just kind of like that feedback from the start of like whether something's working or not and be able to like, number one, be good at taking feedback. And number two, just kind of like address it as soon as you can. So that you can just kind of like, pivot or like, see what direction story has to go towards or like what additional criteria like it needs so that like again like it feels like a quest and not like a random bout of like events like happening, which can work for like certain games. Like there's games kind of like in Journey where it's just kind of like the experience, right, and super open where like that works. But there's others where like generally speaking you want kind of like you want it to feel like a quest, you want it to feel that there's like completion, there's after progression, um when it comes to just working with the story.
Makes sense. Okay, so to bring it all together, I guess my question would be, what advice do you have for people writing in games, narrative designers? What advice would you have for them in consideration of working on emergent narrative?
Like if they're working currently in a project or if they want to get started in like emergent narrative.
Let's do both. Let's start with if they want to get started, and then we'll do if they're working on a project.
Okay, yeah, because I actually had a couple of people reach out to me where I noticed that they had a background in like computer science and English, which I thought was like really interesting. And so I think that having that like blended understanding that like when you're doing emergent narrative, more so than like in other, I think, branches of the discipline, you do need that technical understanding. You do need that engine knowledge. So I would definitely recommend, and I'm not sponsored, like I just took one of the courses and I think that it's great, like Senva, I think it's the name, CENVA. And I can like send you a link of it where like basically like it's like these courses and workshops of like different game engines and different genres where they will teach you just kind of like either the foundations of like Unreal Engine 5, or they will teach you just kind of like here's how you make an RPG in Unreal 5. Here's how you make like a horror. Like they go into like the genres, and they have like videos, guidance, and also PDFs. I don't know if it's me being used to like textbooks, but like I prefer like learning a game engine through like the documentation in a PDF than I do like spending like 30 hours where like I had the certifications for it and I can use the engines. It's just kind of like annoying having to like, like you think you got a concept, but then you gotta go back to the video, right? So first it's also like understanding how you learn best. So once you figure out like what kind of like learning content works for you, find more of that and lean into like learning of like 50 parts like game writing and 50 parts like game engine would be my recommendation for people just trying to like get into it. A lot of like emergent narrative is just kind of like inputting like in systems, in tools, using CSVs. And yeah, there's a lot of like tutorials that I can go on recommend. And then like when you're actually working in a project, like my advice would just kind of like really be in like play and write, like test the thing, then make some edits, and then kind of like account for just kind of like when talking with whoever your collaborator is of like giving yourself time to like work on it, because like there's times where like Xander designers, like I don't know if this happens to you, where like I would think like, oh yeah, like I can get this character sheet done in like a day, but
Mhm.
then life happens, right? So you want to have that contingency. You want to have that kind of like buffer period where like, okay, but like, what if I get like a call or I have to run an errand or I have to like, do XYZ? Like you always want to like have that in the back of your mind. So like always have a contingency plan, play and write, and also play games like, what we're talking about, like that have emergent narratives themselves, so that if something's like not working or like you feel like it could be better, like just step away from the work and then like think of a game that does it really well or does it in the way that you want it to see, like in your game.
Mhm.
Not in like, don't copy, but more so like try to take inspiration from like the people that have done it and shipped what you want to like, have shipped and stuff. Um, and then just come back with like a fresh perspective and ideas to your work.
Do you force yourself to play stuff that you wouldn't normally just to expand your horizons?
I do. I did it a lot years ago. Now, not so much,
Mhm.
but yeah, I've been like trying to get more into games because there's kind of like this like running gag that like, when you're a game developer, you don't have a time to like, play games. But then I'm
Mhm.
like, I found a little bit of time. So I'm just kind of like pretty much like forcing myself to just kind of like steal my husband's Steam library and just
Right
try
on.
something new.
That works. Do you keep a notebook on hand when you're playing games? Is that
It depends on what my intention is. Like there's times where like I want to shut off my brain and just like enjoy the game. And then there's other
right?
times where like a very great class that I had was, shout out to Glenn, by the way, Mike. He has like a master's in Shakespeare and was my professor at Wrangling, super like amazing and funny. And he would teach, what is it, like reading for writers as a course.
Hmm.
And so the reading for writers course was basically touching on just kind of like, you're not just like reading the book, you have kind of like a notebook open and you're taking notes of like, what do you like about the sentence structure? What do you like about the way that the content is structured? What do you like about how it's being presented, the dialogue? Like, what is it that you're liking about this book that you would like to see more of? Because that program, even though I took like game writing classes in it, was more so like tailored towards people that wanted to pursue creative writing and publishing. Um, and so I look at that from like a game developer's angle, where it's just kind of like, I've taken like Octopath Traveler was a game that I would actually have a lot like a notebook open while I was like playing it, just because I was taking notes of like what I was liking about this game so much, and what I could probably like embed in my future projects. And so even though I'm playing the game and I'm enjoying the game, I'm also like pausing and seeing kind of like, okay, like Is it the NPC interactions that are moving like the story forward for me? Is it just kind of like this inventory system? Do I like it? Do I not? How the map is structured, the level, the world building. And so I would just kind of like take notes about what I was liking, where again, like it's not reading for writers, but like playing for game developers. This kind of like same framework, different medium.
Mhm.
And that's kind of like how I would go about it. No, that was a really good question because it's a very good exercise to just kind of like it might feel weird to like some people of like, wait, like you get paid to play games and it's like, no, we conduct research. Which is true
It's
because it's
true.
like I'm not like shutting off my brain and just like, playing or something. It's like you're actually just kind of like taking in the experience and seeing like what they're doing right or like what they could have improved upon and like how you can just kind of like have your own take, your own version of it.
Yeah. Very good. I'm curious, through your education journey, did you ever want to write creative? Like, did you ever think, hey, I'm going to write a novel or short story or?
I did write a novel and I did write short stories and poems and comics.
Is any published and I missed them in my research?
Oh, on purpose or not. Oh my God. No.
Okay.
I was so like because the thing is it's like my thesis was a novel that was basically set in my hometown of Cartagena de Indias, where it explored kind of like this couple where my hometown had like very interesting restrictions, which is like something that shocks a lot of like people like in the West. So when COVID was happening, you could only go out depending on your gender and the last digit of your social security number. Yeah. So it was like Mondays, women who's like so ended in like this digit could go out. Then because it's a Catholic country, right? So like what can you do?
Yeah.
But so it had like very interesting like restrictions and also it had what was it? You could also like go out like when it was like in the like early stages. No, like in the middle kind of. But this book, it was set around a woman who was like, she was like a nail technician. And then obviously like that's like a career that like just completely halted during like the pandemic in Colombia because of how strict the restrictions were. So she takes in this stray dog and realizes that the stray dog had like puppies. And so she's having to like basically stay completely at home. Her husband's also working from home. And there's just tensions that come with like, having like these puppies running around in like this small house in El Centro, Cartagena. So I wrote a novel about it that needed a lot of edits, in my opinion. That was my thesis. And so I've had published poems years ago, but that novel in specific, yeah, it was just kind of like if you went with me to like if you went to like my college, you would have seen it maybe, but like don't worry, it's like
Okay.
I don't even know if I have a copy of my novel. That's something I probably should. Whoops.
Well,
My bad.
maybe you might want it someday. That's so cool. All right. Well, let's bring it into the game talk here. Um, Looking into the future, what do you think the future of games in general, narrative design in general? What are the trends do you think that get you excited? Let's talk about the good ones. What's something that gets you excited?
Something that gets me excited and seeing people realizing like I guess, connection between a good story makes for like a really immersive game and just kind of like pushing for like having a narrative driven project. It's like it's I don't know, it's a verb that I see so often in like studios where like we're a studio working on a narrative driven title, and it's like that's cool. So I really hope that everybody's like hiring as many narrative designers as I think that they're putting out for. Other trends that I've noticed, I am seeing a bit of like interest in like more technical narratives. So I think that just kind of like pushing towards like people that have like that prowess with like just technical knowledge and that also want to like explore storytelling, I think is something that I'm noticing, like because I think I'm plugged into like 17 job boards, so I can kind of like see like sort of like like a bit of trends here and there. I've actually seen some junior narrative designer roles open up in Europe. So like we're seeing like more narrative design just kind of like across the globe rather than like the same companies like in the Bay Area. So I really hope that just kind of like other studios like across the world like take note of like this trend where like other people are noticing it. So oftentimes that's like a conversation for like maybe like not a back podcast, but like should you relocate for a job in games? That's like a big topic, and it's one of those where like my opinion is that I recommend people just go to like where their community is. If your community happens to be like a gaming hub, or like in my case, like the East Coast, right? Like that's kind of like I'm close to Baltimore, Pittsburgh, and like a bunch of cities. And my friends happen to live here. Like I moved here just kind of like to family and friends, but it also happens to like, open avenues. And I hope that other like developers just kind of like around the East Coast like also notice that need for like narrative design. Yeah. Trying to think what other trends I've noticed. A lot of like choice heavy games as well. I mean, Baldur's Gate is like the obvious one, but I believe the folks at like Inkle Studios are also working on a new title that I'm really interested in. And not necessarily a trend, super looking forward Dark Web Streamer. I don't know if you've heard of that game. It's making the rounds, but it's basically like a narrative driven roguelike where you play as like a streamer that actually goes into the dark web. And so it's completely like it's got procedurally generated stories. So very much like, related to what we're talking about. And in one of the interviews, the developer spoke about like an early version of the game had Twitch integration. So that meant that like while you are streaming on Twitch, if your chat kind of like left a comment, the game would notice that and make your Twitch chat characters that are canon in the game.
That's cool.
Yeah. So I'm super hyped about it. The development team's like super cool people, Tony Lee and Chantal Ryan. So I know that's not really like a trip, but more so like that's something that I'm really looking forward to, where like we see this like almost like blurring of like what is a video game and then what is an immersive experience. Like, right? Where like people are able to just kind of like be immersed in the game and then the game responds back to you. That I think is a really cool way of like just merging technology and storytelling in one.
Yeah, that is very cool. I'm gonna have to keep an eye on that too now. Thanks for that.
Yeah. Now I always like just following like indie creators and just kind of like seeing sort of like what they come up with, because there's just so many fresh ideas out there. We're even just going on like itch.io, right? Like you see so many like things come up that you couldn't have like, even I don't know, ideated. Just people's creativity. I love just kind of like noticing it.
It's so cool. Yeah, itch.io is great. Love that place. Okay, well, that's going to wrap up the core stuff. I do have a question that I like to ask everybody who comes on the show, regardless of what you do for a living or what section of the industry or different industries you come from. And that question is, in my opinion, there's a magical space at the intersection of obviously the corner of story and game, but also improv, comedy, comic book writing, music, all these things where people can come together. There's a shared language, there's a fellowship, it just naturally can hang out. If you agree with this little theory of mine, and not everybody does, but if you do, what is the magical thread that holds that space together?
The space of story and game.
The emergent community that comes out of the intersection of these creative fields, such as game design, fiction writing, game writing, narrative design, but also improv acting and music composition. There's something shared there, in my opinion.
I think it's creativity and freedom are the threads, where it's you want to be able to craft as many stories as possible while still allowing the player as much freedom as possible, and not kind of like almost like cinematic experiences are great, but there's times where like games kind of like feel like it's a movie that's interacted with, when it's like kind of like your more traditional approach to narrative design. And I think that when you start kind of like almost like having this rebelliousness, right, when it comes to like coming up with stories that just kind of like flower, that in itself just kind of like it's not new. It's from like an emergent narrative has been around since like 99. But so I think that would be kind of like the two threads, if I can just kind of like cheat.
Yeah, sure. Why not?
It's creativity and freedom.
I love it. It's a good answer. Okay, before we start heading for the door, I like to do a little quick fire just to get to know you a little bit better. If you got a second, what are you reading right now?
What am I reading right now? I've been reading a lot of webtoons, honestly. I've been rereading The Remarried Empress, and I started another one that's villainous in this world, I think. as the name of it. There's a lot of them where it's one of those where they have like really long titles, and I'm like, this art is very pretty. But that's kind of like what I've been reading a lot of. They're like favorite. There's one called The Mafia Nanny where like it's a very interesting medium because you can see kind of like how the artists really take advantage of the like real estate that the mobile screen gives you, and they're really just kind of like guiding viewers and readers through with like amazing sequential art, because also they take classes in sequential art because I wanted to do graphic novels before games. And then like this meeting just kind of like grabbed me and I fell in love. So yeah, again, like because of like that kind of like background in like graphic novels and comics, I really appreciate just kind of like being able to like read a webtoon and like see how they're like adjusting to like the different format and like how like the reader kind of like follows the panels. But that's what I've been reading, a lot of webtoons.
What are you playing these days?
I have been playing a lot of Baldur's Gate 3. I'm a little bit late on it, I know, but my husband got us a copy like the console, so like we just kind of like spend our evenings together, just kind of like playing. I also finished playing Kamaeru, which is like this super adorable cozy game where you just get to like make like these frog refuges and like save a bunch of frogs. It's really cute. And let's see, Kamaeru. Yeah, I think those are the main ones right now. I finished Kamaeru, but I'm still obviously going through Baldur's Gate 3, but I'm not going to spoil what part I mean.
Okay. All right, here's the toughest one of all. If your essence was perfectly distilled down, your personality, your knowledge, who you are, and then injected into a game, so it could be tabletop, could be a digital game, could be a board game, what game would it be? What world? And what would your character be? Like race and class, or if it's a digital game, what character would you take up?
What game would it be? I've always had kind of like a lot of questions about just kind of like identity and stuff. So it's one of those where like, I don't know if the game has been made.
There you go.
Yeah, it's one of those where I also just kind of wanted to respond coffee. I've been drinking so much that I think my essence is just coffee at this point.
That's a good answer too.
It's just kind of like especially like the Matsing packs, which is just kind of like they're like these packages of like Korean coffee where it's kind of like the sweetener and instant coffee like all in one package. So it's just you boil the water, pour the pack, and that's it. So yeah, there was what's the game? There's been like a bit of an increase in indie games from Latin America. And whenever just kind of like I come across those titles where like it's not like just one specifically, but it's just kind of like the energy that they're giving of like when you just kind of like hear the music and you hear just kind of like when they draw you in. Like I'm thinking of, for example, Atuel, which is made by like an Argentinian team where it's free on itch.io and you just kind of like get to play and be immersed in the experience of like the Atuel River. And so like whenever I see games that just kind of like can take like their Latinidad, put it at the forefront, that's kind of like the type of game that I want to design, that I would maybe down the road come back to you and be like, this game that I made, that's where my essence is.
That's a good answer. The world that your essence belongs in, you haven't made it yet.
Yeah, I always have like a lot of projects that I'm working on. So it's just kind of like I'm trying to like put a piece of myself in them as much as I can within bandwidth and stuff.
Of course. All right. Well, we're going to start heading for the door. I do like to open up a little bit of space here. Is there anything that you've done or doing that you want to promote? Or conversely, where can people find you online if they want to follow you?
Oh yeah, if you see kind of like my name in the video or the podcast episode, look it up, or like Saravia, and then it's kind of like my handle across social media. Something that I think has been spoken about a little bit here is I'm one of the co-founders of Small Studio, which is basically a collective of game developers where we just get together and try to like, make games of like large scopes. So small loan, big dreams. It's kind of like an inside joke that we have. And right now we are preparing to update the Ouroboros Express with voiceover lines, new art, and just like a lot of cool updates on it. And so like in smaller studios, like in social media channels, which just at smaller studio, that can all be seen. I'm always like really proud of like how far the entire thing has come, because in November we would have been like around for a year, which like is really hard to like imagine kind of like the journey where like we started just kind of like, hey, let's like, do this little game for a game jam, and then it like became this game that I've seen like presented in like Berlin even. Like it's kind of like grown out of, yeah, honestly, it's just kind of like something that I'm super proud of, just kind of like being there for the beginning and helping developers like learn and seeing writers explore more of implementation and game engines. Um, I'm really proud of it and really happy about what they've done. So that's pretty much it. Like, yeah, like just I have a copy page and then also just kind of like, sorry, I switched into like Spanish real quick. Um, and then also like Smaller Studio on like all socials.
Cool. I will make sure to include the links in the notes for people to click on and find it. All right, well, time for us to close up shop. But as we're heading for the door, I would love to give you the last word. Do you have any parting words of wisdom?
Yes, the words that I would have is just kind of like keep at it. As cliche as it sounds, but I feel like there's been a lot of like upsetting like news cycles, just kind of like in the industry as a whole, but just kind of like if you understand that not just the whatever project you're working on or whatever, like, you know, your game you're working on, right? When you understand that it's a marathon and not a sprint, and that you just kind of like have to go at it like, you know, one piece at a time at your own pace, things are gonna turn out okay. I don't know. I like being a little bit optimistic in podcasts.
Once again, the enchanted lanterns are flickering on and off, so that's my signal for us to close up shop. But before we go, thank you to Andrea for sharing your insights and wisdom on this always compelling topic. And to you, dear listener, as always, thank you for taking your seat at the table. Until we meet again, keep creating, sharing, and exploring those stories and worlds. Stay safe, Wanderer. Your chair will be ready by the fire the next time you stop in at the corner of Story and Game.